Hello. Good morning.
Hello. So,
Can they not see?
can you put it up on that screen? Try and do that. We are trying to put you. Okay. Now you're in the big screen. So Professor Zöller is going to speak on neither democracy nor republic, Kant's modern polity. Thank you, Professor Zöller. Please. 35 minutes
Thank you.
talk, 10 minutes for discussion.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for the invitation to speak. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in this gathering of Indian and international Kant scholars and philosophers. I only wish I could be with you in person, for I have fond memories of my real-life participation in a conference that took place several years ago at the Sanskrit department of Jawaharlal Nehru University on the outskirts of New Delhi, and that included displays, ceremonies, and rituals that deeply impressed me. Section 1, Kant's Rationalism. A philosopher's political thinking tends to be particularly shaped, perhaps even constitutively circumscribed, by the historical horizon, cultural conditions of that philosopher's own time and place. Plato's oligarchic polity, Aristotle's mixed constitution, Machiavelli's neo-Roman republic, Hobbes' absolutist state, and Locke's constitutional monarchy are clear cases in point. In Kant's case, the formative horizon is defined by the bureaucratically administered territorial state of absolute enlightened absolutism, by the peculiar position of Prussia between retardation and progress, and by the special civico-social conditions in a remote and rural East Prussia, including Kant's hometown, Königsberg. While Kant is cognizant of multiple forms of political life in other places and at other times, his personal political experience is marked by several facts and circumstances that are easily overlooked in current attempts to make his philosophical political philosophy speak to us today, outside of the learned republic, of the local university, of which Kant was a lifelong member. He was not in a position to ever have taken part in an official election at any level, either as a voter or as a voter. Kant's status in the Kingdom of Prussia was that of a subservient subject, with limited civil rights and practically no political rights. As a civil servant in Prussia's university system, Kant did not enjoy academic freedom, neither in his teaching, where he was bound to follow preordained textbooks, nor in his publications, which were subject to various forms of state and church censorship. The Prussia of Kant's time was an absolute monarchy without any parliamentary bodies, with a manorial system of local government, including a decentralized administration of justice, and with a late feudal society divided into rigidly separated social strata, an authoritarian and militarized state that lacked independently governed free cities and was mainly made up of a peasant population stuck in indentured servitude. To be sure, in 1794, late Enlightenment Prussia issued a unified legal code, valid for all the members of the kingdom, which had the historical distinction of unifying, for the first and only time, disparate legal country codes of a country, including civil, criminal, and public law, into a comprehensive set of legal laws. But while the universal law of the land of the Prussian states served to unify the socio-culturally diverse parts of Prussia, it did not substantially alter the rigid corporate stratification of Prussian society into pre-delineated orders or states. During Kant's lifetime, Prussia's sole claim to liberty resided in the intellectual freedom granted to, or rather claimed by, the small educated class of professionals, pastors, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, and university professors, that constituted a minuscule public interacting among themselves through numerous print media and extended private correspondence. Enlightenment in late 18th century Prussia, this was an affair of the few, and to no small part devoted to the largely theoretical critique of the widespread prejudices and commonly held superstitions to be found among the majority of the populace. By comparison, the freedom enjoyed by Kant and the Kingdom of Prussia lagged behind the extent of freedom, however threatened, previously enjoyed by Spinoza in the Dutch Republic, but Rousseau in the Free City State of Geneva and by Locke in constitutionally monarchical England, not to mention the conditions of liberty and equality proclaimed and claimed in the newly arisen revolutionary republics of North America and France. Under these circumstances, it is all the more astonishing and altogether admirable that Kant produced a body of work in political philosophy that proved influential and even inspirational for later political theory and practice throughout today. But it is also no surprise that the basic features of Kant's political philosophy still show clear traces of the contemporary political condition in which he found himself and within which his considered views had to be publicized and published. As a matter of fact, Kant's main work in political philosophy remains within an early modern continental European framework that is marked by absolutist monarchism, firm opposition to democracy as popular despotism, and deep skepticism about republics as unsuited to the territorially extended modern bureaucratically administered state. Under these circumstances, the point of drawing on Kant when it comes to identifying the defining features of the modern polity is not to follow the letter of his social political thinking, but to extract the spirit of his political philosophical reasoning. Together with Kant, who has the benefit of greater historical understanding of politics, past and present, Kant, despite a certain Prussian parochialism, emerges as a major advocate of the modern state and its civil society. Section 2, Kant's legalism. Among the several pioneering distinctions introduced by Kant into philosophy must be counted the principal differentiation between right and ethics. The early modern tradition of natural law had included moral concepts and doctrines in the formal treatment of preterpositive law, in effect moralizing legal matters. By contrast, beginning in work from the early 1780s, Kant distinguishes between the specifically different spheres of juridical and the ethical, on the basis of the kind of law-giving or legislation involved. Juridical right involves external legislation, concerns the conditions of the external use of one's arbitrary choice, and is based on the engagement of one's external freedom, while ethics involves internal legislation, concerns the conditions of the internal use of one's arbitrary choice, and is based on the engagement of one's internal freedom. In addition, right resorts to coercion, whereas ethics operates on the basis of respect. While maintaining the specific difference between ethical and juridical obligation, Kant also recognizes a formal feature shared by juridical and ethical obligatedness alike. According to Kant, both kinds of obligation forego contextual or material reasons for their obligatory force in favor of deriving the latter solely from the very form of lawfulness, or legality as necessary and sufficient basis of their normative nature. In the case of right, the lawfulness is what Kant calls juridical lawfulness, consisting in the universal mutual compatibility of everyone following juridical laws, no matter what their motivation in doing so is. In the case of ethics, the lawfulness is ethical lawfulness, also a term in Kant, and consists in one's subjective principle of willing and acting, maxim, being able to serve as everyone's moral or rather ethical principle. They are shared formal feature of lawfulness in willing and acting notwithstanding, Kant maintains, though, the original difference between juridical and ethical theory as well as practice, for which he recognizes no shared substantial principle, but only a generically cast common formula under the guise of lawfulness qua generic practical principle. In historical terms, Kant's espousal of legalism belongs into the Enlightenment tradition of dissociating the social norms enabling and assuring the peaceful and prosperous living together of people of different persuasions, primarily of a different or religious kind, from the impact of individual creeds and allegiances. Yet, legalism in Kant moves from the accommodating attitude of tolerating dissent to the affirmative espousal of principled indifference on the part of the law to the fundamental differences of opinion and belief governing human modern society. In systemic terms, the Kantian dissociation of right from ethics in general and the elimination of ethics from natural right in particular involves a redefinition of politics from its previous theory and practice. The Aristotelian tradition had allied politics with ethics, regarding the former as an extension of the latter, and including politics into a broad conception of ethics qua morals. On Kant's legalist outlook, politics is an extension not of ethics but of right, in the manner of an applied doctrine of right, Kant's term. The realignment of politics with right also dissociates politics from its early modern Roman-inspired reduction of the potentially immoral exercise of civil sagacity or political prudence, as cultivated by Machiavelli. Instead, politics for Kant is grounded in entirely a priori principles of right. In particular, politics for Kant is not exhausted by ad hoc measures in response to ever-changing circumstances and conditions, but is to be, again, Kant's phrase, politics cognizable a priori, based on non-empirical juridical principles. Accordingly, the politician envisioned by Kant is not a political moralist, his term, who bends his principle to his politics, but a moral politician, more specifically a juridical moral politician who follows a priori principles of right, is engaged in a moral, juridically based politics. Section 3, Kant's liberalism. In Kant's systematically conceived, though sporadically publicized political philosophy, the legalism involving the principal independence of right from ethics is joined by a sustained focus on freedom, or rather liberty, as the sole original and inborn right that each and every human being possesses in virtue of their humanity, and that consists in everyone's, quote, independence from another's arbitrary choice, insofar as this freedom can coexist with the freedom of everyone else, according to universal law. Kant's rights-based liberalism combines the granting of individual freedom with the requirement that freedom be granted to everyone in the manner of Kant's phrase, equal freedom, or universal freedom, also Kant's phrase. As indicated by the key concept of humanity, adduced as freedom's juridicatory basis, freedom pertains not to the human being in his or her individuality, but sets them off from other human beings, but in their humanity, which they share with all other human beings, and which reveal the freedom in question to be general, German allgemein, in the sense of common to all. The strictly social character that, according to Kant, ab origine pertains to freedom, sets Kant's liberalism apart from the originally individualist liberalism in the British tradition of Locke and Mill. Rather than requiring a secondary principle in addition to freedom by liberty, designed to avert the hurtful consequences for others of liberal individualism's excesses, Mill's harm principle, Kantian social liberalism originally includes into the very conception of freedom the lawful limitation of the freedom of each to the freedom of all. Modern Kant's liberalism integrates individual freedom with universal lawfulness. In the same vein, Kant's liberalism of lawful autonomic freedom, due to its defining feature of lawfulness, differs from classical British liberalism's primary focus on the negative freedom from societal and governmental strictures placed upon the liberal individual. The innovative credential of Kant's law-based version of juridical political liberalism, a liberalism of equal and universal freedom, resides not in the enthroning of the liberal individual, the embracing of individuality, and the propagating of individualism. Instead, Kant's liberal stance turns on formal freedom, replacing, once and for all, the teleological thinking that had informed the foundations of politics, right, and ethics since Aristotle under the guise of some highest good or ultimate end. In particular, Kantian liberalism abandons the Aristotelian, Neo-Aristotelian primacy or primary pursuit of the good life or the happy life in exchange for the pointed pursuit of freedom as such and for its own sake. And this in politics as much as in juridical right and in ethics. Accordingly, the autonomy educated and advanced by Kant is not, at least not originally and primarily, individual or personal self-determination in the manner of classical and neoclassical liberalism, but generic, universalist, and rationalist self-determination. That freedom in Kant is not first established on the individual level, and subsequently curbed at the inter-individual level, but realized and restricted at the same time in one and the same instance. Freedom is realized only through restriction, and restrictions are justified only in view of freedom. Moreover, the integrated realization-restriction or restriction-realization of freedom does not take place in the proto-legal framework of the state of nature, even though the latter, according to Kant, already knows private right entitlements, though lacks the legal institution of their adjudication in case of conflict. Rather, freedom is properly realized and suitably restricted only in the civil state. In addition to civil freedom, citizenship in the polity for Kant includes, as much as requires, civil equality, or the citizen's capacity of being legally obligated by no one whom the citizen in turn is not able to obligate, with the sole exception of the polity's sovereign, whoever that may be. And civil independence, or the citizen's ability to establish and maintain economic self-reliance on the basis of possessing some trade, profession, or property. The latter condition attaches far-reaching civico-political consequences to economic inequality and excludes, on principal grounds, substantial parts of the contemporary population, in the main domestic servants, itinerant laborers, indentured peasants, and all women, from the status of fully entitled citizenship. The remaining core of genuine citizens, to be considered civically free and equal, essentially consists of independent landowners in the countryside and the bourgeoisie in the towns, who enjoy the liberal life form of being their own master. The resultant civico-political order, in the age of Kantian liberalism, is not the essentially post-Bismarckian welfare state of the late 19th and early 20th century, espoused by neo-Kantian socialism, but the juridico-political liberal state characterized in English by the phrase rule of law and called in German Rechtsstaat and in French état de droit. Section 4 comes from republicanism. While the basic distinction between right and ethics established and the central focus on equal freedom in place, Kant's political philosophy is poised to address the question of civil society's formal constitution and institutional power structure. Under the influence of the contemporaneous revolutionary developments in neighboring France, the distance of some 900 miles between Paris and Königsberg notwithstanding, Kant's political thinking in the 1790s is couched in Republican terminology and conceptuality. To be sure, Kant's repeated references to Republican, Republic, and Republicanism do not amount to a full-blown endorsement of the Republican Constitution in general and France's post-monarchical development in particular. Kant's Republican reflections before, during, and after the French Revolution feature the Republic not as an actually existing state and its constitution, but as a contrafactual norm and as a guiding representation that orients and directs juridical political thinking and acting. Already, Kant's very first definition of the Republic, provided in the context of the Platonically inspired doctrine of ideas as concepts of reason in the critique of pure reason, defines the Commonwealth by means of freedom of each of its members, insofar as the latter is compatible, according to a universal law, with the freedom of everyone else in that political community. The freedom in question, in the juridical political context, in a Republican perspective, is the freedom of individual arbitrary choice. For Kant, the identification of the Republic or Commonwealth of the free and equal as a Platonic idea is both modest and demanding. On the one hand, it is a mere idea compared to the factual insufficiencies of the actually prevailing juridical and political conditions. On the other hand, the guiding idea of the Republic involves the unconditionally valid demand to arrange and address stately order, especially its legal basis, in accordance with the idea of the Republic. In the further articulation of Kant's freedom-based idea of the Republic, the counterfactual construct of equal freedom, supplemented by the fictitious representation of the legitimating origin of society in a statewide contract, social contract, envisions the collective citizenry as the proper bearer of the state's legislative power. In agreement with his platonically inspired practical idealism regarding the status of the Republic, Kant understands this original sovereignty of the people not as a concrete political empowerment to popular masses, but as the latter's principal entitlement to live under those laws only which the people, fictionally viewed and simulatively considered as if they have given to themselves. Kant conveys the juridical political function of the Republican singular as a Platonic idea for the establishment, arrangement, and maintenance of any concrete polity by taking recourse to the critical distinction between appearance and thing in itself. In particular, he confronts the multiple phenomenal manifestations of the Commonwealth with the latter's purely intellectual basic form, the Res Publica Nomen, as he calls it. Drawing on the traditional hermeneutic distinction between the spirit and the letter of a text, Kant declares republicanism to be, at least ideally so, the inner principle or spirit of a state's constitution, as opposed to the letter's outward setup or letter. Kant, the republic as an organizational shape of the Commonwealth, and republicanism as a political position have morphed into a simulative spiritualism and a methodological fictionalism in the service of the juridical adjudication of manifestly non-republican political conditions. This modal transformation of republicanism from the actual and concrete to the simulative and fictional in Kant is joined by a related change in the very content of the concept of a republic. Rather than continuing the traditional Roman-inspired conception of the republic as a monarchical, aristocratical, democratically mixed constitution, Kant, following Montesquieu, contrasts the republic not primarily to monarchy, but to despotic regimes of all, compared to which both republic and monarchy serve as preferable alternatives. In so doing, Kant defines as the common trait of all despotic regimes the institutional as well as personal non-distinction between the bearer of the legislative power and the bearer of the executive power in a state. By contrast, Kant considers the institutional and personal distinction between legislative and executive power a necessary as well as sufficient criteria for a republican governed commonwealth, regardless of whether the state in question is formally constituted as a republic or a monarchy. Kant's dissociation of the republican mode of government from the republican constitution is based on the conceptual distinction between the form of state, which is either monarchic, aristocratic, or democratic, and the mode of government, which is either republican or despotic. According to Kant, it matters more than the government of a state maintain law and order and serve the public interest in the manner of a republic than how the state in question is formally constituted. For Kant, the hallmark of modern, juridically realized republicanism is the institutional instrument of representation, by means of which political power is distributed and balanced. To be sure, for Kant, political representation does not involve the regular general election of a legislative body as a representation of the people. To Kant, already instituting a head of state, sovereign, involves representation, and so as the proper ideal sovereign, the fictionally gathered entire people, is represented, Kant's terminology, through a formal figure, a figurehead. Most importantly, though, according to Kant, the political principle of representation, and with it the distribution of power in accordance with the republican idea of the state, holds for the relationship between the supreme lawgiver, the sovereign legislature, and the state's organs executing and adjudicating given laws. Only where the legislator, whether a monarch or a governing body, does not also undertake and oversee the application of the given laws is despotism banned and are republican conditions assured. Kant leaves open the mechanism for the delegation of power under the guise of legislative, executive, and judicative representation. In particular, the principle of the free and equal election of a popular representative body, which had been introduced only recently on the European continent during the French Revolution, remained alien to Kant's political imagination. Juridical political representation, republicanism, and Kant remains nomadic, spirit, and simulative as if, albeit already quite modern, with regard to the principle of separation of powers and the principle of political representation. Final section, Kant's republicanism cum commercialism. In Kant's comprehensive political philosophy, legalism, liberalism, and republicanism that mark civil society in general and its constitutional setup in particular are joined by a sustained consideration of the relation between plural polities organized along legal, liberal, and republican principles. The rationale behind widening the political philosophical perspective from an individual polity to a possible community of such polities is the existential threat polities pose to each other in the absence of constitutional, institutional guarantees for their rightful relations to each other. In historical terms, Kant's federative approach to relations between states partakes in the early modern peace discourse, chiefly conducted by the Abbé de Saint-Pierre and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But while the earlier contributions to the debate aim at a league of princes composed of the monarchs of Europe's leading political powers, who are supposed to commit themselves to peaceful measures for settling their territorial claims and dynastic disputes, Kant combines the outward federation of the main European states with their inward republicanization. To be sure, Kant acknowledges the factual persistence of absolute, though enlightened monarchies on the European continent. But he counts on those monarchies adopting a quasi-republican civico-political mindset, which seems to him a satisfactory simulation of an actual popular and representative republic. For Kant, as for most of his contemporaries, including Montesquieu, the republican type of constitution is considered suited to smaller states, especially ancient and medieval city-states, and therefore is essentially a thing of the past. Somewhat surprisingly, in Kant's federative reflections on the contemporary counterexample of the territorially extended and rapidly expanding North American Federal Republic remains invisible, or at least irrelevant, for a possible European development. Montesquieu's earlier identification of federative republics as combining the principle of republicanism and territorialism notwithstanding. The historical and systematic blind spot on the part of Kant's political imagination regarding federative republics is all the more astonishing, given the federative past and presence of the German lands under the guise of the Holy Roman Empire, which ceased to exist only after Kant's death, and to which Montesquieu even refers to as Federal Republic of Germany, and which even played a minor role in the inspirational role in the founding of the United States. The Pacific Federation of Republican governed monarchical states that Kant has in mind is to be ruled by quasi-contractual legal relations between individual independent states that each retain their sovereignty. In accordance with Kant's legalist, Republican, liberal perspective on politics, the body of law governing the relations between different peoples or nations is to be based on a federation of free states, his phrase. This required freedom of the states involved consists first in a given state's internal freedom from despotic rule, a requirement that repeats Kant's earlier call for a republican or republicly minded civil constitution. And second, the freedom required consists in a given state's external freedom from domination by another state. The political function assigned to the law of the peoples in Kant's fictional perspective peace treaty that includes the free and equal status of the polities in their relation to each other. Under the guidance of the idea of the right of the peoples, Kant's phrase, the measures to be taken for approaching the condition of permanent peaceful peace between states must not limit, much less obliterate, the constitutive inner and outer freedom of each and every state involved. In practical terms, this excludes any attempt at establishing a universal monarchy. In particular, the fundamental freedom requirement of the law of the peoples prohibits the fusion of plural peoples into an ever-growing state of peoples, Kant's term, that would ultimately comprise the entire world and its governance as a world state. Its idealizing designation notwithstanding, such a world republic would not be a state of freedom, but represent the very anathema of republicanism, namely a despotism established on a global scale. Still, Kant concedes the peaceful rather than bellicose international relations under the ruling idea of the law of the peoples cannot come about and prevail without a political organization that replicates or modified and mitigated the coercively controlled and checked rule of law operative at the level of individual free states. Barring the state-like superstructure of a superstate exercising totalizing, not to say totalitarian power, the internationalist political instrument conducive to lasting peace, countenanced by Kant, is his words, federation. Kant is enough of a political realist, though, to acknowledge that the legalist, liberal, and republican conditions imposed upon relations between individual polities is insufficient for ensuring lasting, so-called eternal peace between them. With an additional argument that draws not on his durely framed philosophy of the modern polity, but on his teleologically cast political philosophy of history, Kant deduces commercialism, in addition to legalism, liberalism, republicanism, and federalism, as a clandestine guarantee, or at least support, of lasting peace between sovereign states. In particular, Kant appeals to the commercial spirit, his term, of the modern polity, and notes the general contestation and effective curtailment of state power by monetary power, again his term, in modern civil society. On Kant's assessment, the immense costs of warfare tend to outweigh the latter's political gains, especially in the eyes of an increasingly politically influential citizenry that is no longer willing to bear the material burden or a monarchical self-aggrandizement carried out at the expense of subservient subjects on the brink of becoming legislating citizens, including the remarks. To be sure, the political nationalism and imperialism, faithfully tied to the political movements of liberalism and republicanism since the mid-19th century, eventually would refute Kant's confidence in the peaceful potential of civic commercial spirit. By the time World War I came around, the by then politically emancipated bourgeoisie had become the bearer of militarism and authoritarianism, a dramatic reversal that is resurfacing in the current erosion of legalist, liberalist, and republicanist political principles by means of the neo-authoritarian self-abolition of deliberative democracy in favor of pseudo-democratic mass movements and crypto-oligarchic populative regimes the world over. While Kant thought that a democratically elected government, including a democratically elected head of state, was not necessary for a rightful commonwealth, given his embracement of monarchy, our age is learning that such a democratically elected government and head of state is not sufficient for a rightful commonwealth either. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very enlightening paper, Professor Zöller. Now questions, please. I can't take too many questions. Can you all listen to me? Is this mic working? Okay. Any questions, please? Anyone? Yes, please. Meenakshi.
Thanks, Professor Zöller, and it's a very complex and very detailed talk. And I do not have much exposure in political philosophy, but if I may ask a very naive question, that,
yes, please.
Given the fact that, democracy is nowadays looked upon, particularly maybe perhaps in the Rawlsian framework, as involving a paradox, how to reconcile between individual liberty and equality. So, Kantian framework, of course, you have said a lot of details. The answer must have been, can be incorporated there. But if it is possible for you to, pinpoint that, within Kantian framework, what will be, what he has to offer as a salubrious reconciliation between the two. That is a demand, the paradoxical demand for both individual liberty as well as the equal rights for everybody.
Yes, sir. That's true. I would agree both with you and your reference to Rawls that in Kant already, the freedom is connected with the principle of equality. But as I also stressed in my paper, it's not social or economic equality. So that the issues of social justice that have arisen after Kant in the 19th century and throughout the 20th century are still with us and need to be addressed by a theory that isn't entirely and completely Kantian, that includes other elements, maybe Kantianizing elements, but also maybe Hegelian elements and other such features, Marxian elements, that would include these aspects. So I stress again, the equality featured in the Kantian account tied to liberty, most co-equal in status with liberty, is juridical equality, equality before the law and equality in the possession of rights, but not yet, we might say, the kind of social equality that has become much more an urgent issue in the processes of democratization. And part of my point in the paper was to make us aware of the somewhat anachronistic enterprise that we're engaged in when we try to apply these Kantian principles that stem from the 18th century and from an entirely pre-democratic and pre-republican social political imagination to the current issues or developments since the 19th century. Can be done, but it is done with Kantian principles rather than as a simple interpretation or explication of Kant's own theory. So you need much more and further historical authors, you might say, and also contemporary theory to do that, which is what Rawls, as one of the main proponents of a neo-Kantianism in political philosophy, has tried. Thank you very much for this question.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Professor Zöller. This paper is now over. And we now move on to the next paper. Andrew, please.